That's where the ghost tattoo came
Oh,
from. Oh,
oh, hi everyone. Welcome tonight. Thank you for dealing with us while we had a couple technical difficulties this evening. We're working it all out. Um, we're really excited that you could be here tonight to talk about victims' rights. We are here with one of our good friends at Light the Way, and she is joining us as our new partnership with the Gabby Petito Foundation. Um, our licensed attorney, Jess, and I'm going to say her name right. I asked her to send it to me phonetically. Schubert. I said that right, Ness, right? Okay. She's also the executive director of the Foundation Against Crime Victim Exploitation in Social Media, who is also known as Faces. You might have seen some of their social media posts recently, and she's really trying to spread the word on what good content creation looks like, and what that looks like for families and what it should look like as content consumers as well. So we're going to have question and answers at the end. So as you're listening, try and think about that. She's not really going to be able to answer questions specifically to your case, but we want to think about them in general terms. And there will be a recording available later on the Gabby Petito Foundation YouTube page. So if you miss anything, you'll be able to watch it later. I'm going to give some introductions. We'll introduce everybody here tonight. So I'll start with myself. So I'm Shayna. I am the founder of Light the Way Missing Persons Advocacy Project, and I feel really lucky to be able to work with this incredible team. We have a small team at Light the Way, both Haley and Raul, and then this year we are incredibly lucky to be able to partnership with the Gabby Petito Foundation. They are doing wonderful things for both the domestic violence community as well as the missing persons community. And we feel like working together will only make us stronger and be able to support these communities stronger. So I'm really excited for what's to come. And one of our partnership goals is to bring more education to the missing persons community and the unresolved community. So our goal is to have these educational webinars once a month, and this is why we are here this evening with you. Raul?
Hi, I'm Raul. I am a researcher, a advocate, and I am the data specialist with Light the Way. I'm always humbled to be a part of these things because everybody that I do panels with is so much more impressive than me. So I'm just blessed to be a part of Light the Way with Shayna and with Haley that I learn from every single day. I am so deeply honored to work with Jim and Nikki and the Gabby Petito Foundation. And Jess, I am so excited for tonight. I learned from you. I watched from you. So I'm excited to be here. Haley?
Hello, I'm Haley Gray. I am a researcher and writer for multiple podcasts, and I also am the CEO and founder of True Crime Research Training. We just changed our name to be more inclusive of everyone. And then I'm also the media specialist for Light the Way, which is such an honor. And I was so glad when Shayna agreed to let me come on and help. And I've learned so much. And then Raul came on, and he's just so amazing and always ready to help with anything. And then Jim and Nikki, it's truly such an honor to know you and to get to work with you and learn from you. And then Jess, I had the privilege of meeting yesterday, and she's so passionate about helping families. And so I just can't wait for everyone to learn from her. And also, I'm going to be taking notes so that I can help families based on what Jess says. So it's going to be a great night. All right, Jim, you're the last one. You better bring it home.
no, I'm going to do my best. It's kind of hard to follow all that, but I'm Jim Schmidt. I'm the stepdad of Gabby Petito. I'm a board member and secretary of the Gabby Petito Foundation. I'm also currently the vice president of the state Domestic Violence Coalition for Florida. And as a victim of a crime, as a family member losing a child, tonight's topic is something that is certainly near and dear to our heart because not a lot of people are aware of all the resources that are out there. And I feel like this is going to be a great session, very informative. I'm excited to be here, excited to be with everybody on the panel. Everybody's amazing. And our goal is to just try to help as many people as we can. And in order to do that, it takes a village. It takes all of us. And I think we're building a really good partnership with organizations like Light the Way and so many others to try to help bring resolution and answers to so many families out there. And I'm just really excited to be a part of it.
And Jess, I just want to talk a little bit about how I met Jess. So when Light the Way started, we didn't really know anybody in this community. We were two people kind of just trying to connect with other people that we saw doing some good things out in the missing persons community. And I came across Jess because she was covering the case of two little boys who had gone missing. They were the West Boys. And I started listening to Jess talk about their case, and she kind of covered their trial from her point of view as an attorney. And that was really what connected me with her. And so I just slid into her DMs, and we started messaging back and forth, and we realized that we had a lot in common, and that we could do some work together. And so that's how my friendship with Jess started. And I have been really honored to be able to connect with her and to be able to ask her questions. For families, when I'm wondering if this is kind of the right direction on things, or just in general as advocates, is this the right thing we're doing? So I feel really honored to be able to have Jess on this panel this evening. And Jess, if you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, hi everybody. I'm Jess Schubert. I'm an attorney for 24 years now. Before I even talk about myself, I wanted to say congratulations to the Gabby Petito Foundation and Light the Way Missing Persons Project in your collaborative effort now working together. I think that is just so awesome and so inspiring to all the advocates out here to see the work that you are both doing, and now to have you work together is just awesome. So I'm so excited about that for you guys. And I also just wanted to thank Shayna and Raul, Haley, Jim, and Nicole for giving me the opportunity tonight to be here to speak to you about what I'm passionate about, which is crime victim rights. So I will hand it back to you and let you start, and then I will get into more about me and why I'm here.
Awesome. Thank you. So I think we're going to jump right in after those introductions to questions. And so what we're going to do is the panel is kind of pose some questions at you and then have you kind of answer for us. So my first question is kind of a multi-part question. And what we're going to do is we're going to ask some questions about the Victims' Bill of Rights and what that might kind of be. So I'm sorry, I'm like losing my place here on my questions. Okay.
I actually, if you want, I have put together like a presentation. So if that's easier for you, it kind of addresses like what you were saying, and I can just start there if that's helpful.
Absolutely.
We
Go
can
ahead.
continue to go through the questions and have Q&A with the audience if that works.
Absolutely.
All right. So a little bit about me. I wasn't always a crime victims attorney. I've been strictly working with victims for probably the last 5 years, mostly in a pro bono way. I started by, I was always interested in providing legal services pro bono for people, starting in law school when I worked on Long Island in a legal services project for people who were income eligible. So it was a poverty law program. And that I just kind of continued doing, offering pro bono services at times during my career. I grew up with a father who was a criminal court officer in Riverhead in Suffolk County, New York, and a grandmother who was a deputy court clerk. So because of that, I was typically around court. And when I was a child, I was always like, you're not going anywhere near the criminal courts. You're sitting there with your grandmother in her office, and I wasn't allowed to really see anything. But as I got older, I was allowed to sit in on cases, and that interested me in true crime. And so I just had interest in it and would read a lot and do things like that. And then eventually what happened was during the pandemic, I started to engage more in the community of missing people, as well as in the true crime online space. And, that influenced me in different ways, but I was learning a lot through different advocates and people out there teaching. And what I did is I started to take cold cases and to, for the first time ever, approach families, which was actually kind of scary for me and intimidating because I didn't know if that was even appropriate for me to be contacting them. But I tried it and was pretty successful in having them wanting me to collaborate. And so we worked on cold cases. And so my role was to try to get those cases reopened. And that's kind of how I started. And I created a YouTube channel. And then, like you had said earlier, how we met each other and started working together a little bit. And I'm helping you in advisory capacity at times. So that's just a little bit about me. So before we get into the discussion on crime victims, I think it's important to explain what a crime victims attorney is. The reason why I'm doing that is because the way that our crime victims laws and rights have evolved in this country, it's something that is fairly new if you were to look at like the whole history of jurisprudence. It's not to say that victims didn't have rights, but those rights were not really officially recognized until the beginning of, like, I would say the 80s with Ronald Reagan, when he started putting together a task force, and you saw different statutes that were created at that time. And then in 2024, so 21 years ago, I guess, was the federal statute, the Federal Crime Victims Act that was passed. And so it's something that hasn't been around that long, and it has served as a model for states who emulate what those rights are that are in the federal statute. So because of that, in the last 21 years, you see more crime victims attorneys being trained and really working specifically in that distinct role. So it is kind of an emerging area of law. And there's the National Crime Victims Law Institute, which is located out in Portland, Oregon. I had the privilege of being able to go out there last year for their legal conference and meeting with other advocates and attorneys, law enforcement. It was awesome. They're a wonderful resource, and I will definitely give you guys all of that information later. So it might be helpful to you as well. So as a crime victim attorney, the role, like I said, is very distinct and limited. And really, you're just there to represent the interests of the crime victim. And what I'd like you to do is to think about how it is that you envision the criminal court system and the criminal justice process. And if I was to ask everyone, how many parties are there? How many sides are there in a criminal trial? 99% of the time, everyone says two. Right? They say it's the prosecution or the Commonwealth, like the DA, wherever you might live, and it's the defense. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, that's how most people perceive what's happening. But because of these laws that exist that can be exercised by crime victims, there's really a third party that's kind of been overlooked. So I just challenge everyone now that when you are looking at cases from now forward, to think of it as three parties. Sometimes, it is something that there can be some hostility from defense attorneys who feel like, wait, in the courtroom, it's my client's rights and his right to have a fair and speedy trial and like all of those things, right? And they're kind of hesitant almost to look at that, the crime victims' rights. So it is something that you encounter, and I encounter as an attorney, that you really have to strongly advocate for those rights, but nevertheless, they do exist. So just as a very quick brief history, I don't want to bore you, but like I said, in 2004, the Federal Crime Victims Act was passed. And prior to that, states had laws in their state statutes as well in their constitution. Every state has their own constitution, and they all varied, and it was kind of all over the place. And once the federal law was passed, a lot of states started looking to that. And that is what usually happens when a federal statute is enacted, when an act gets passed like this. it's something that will kind of be a map, like a roadmap for states to say, okay, we have to look at this law and see our own provisions and do they reflect this? Because these are the things that are really important. I think that law in 2004 was passed by a vote of like 96 to whatever it was for. I mean, it was like overwhelming majority passed this law. So clearly the provisions in that are very important. And there was an overall support of the majority for that. So the good news is that states can look at that and have looked at that and kind of bolstered some of their own state statutes as well as their constitutions. Now, that act enumerates various rights for a victim, but it only applies to cases that are brought in the federal court system. And for purposes of our discussion tonight, I just want to point out that I'm going to be picking, I took about 9 or 10 of the core rights that are at the state level. Every single state has these laws of some sort, but there is variation. And I'm going to give you a resource later that you'll be able to look up your own state very easily and see what the provisions are that might apply to you if you are a victim or the family of a victim. So most cases are litigated, or not litigated, but prosecuted at the state level, and they are in county offices, law offices are usually prosecuting them. So again, I'm just going to be talking about this in general terms. So just keep in mind that when I'm going through these are the 4 rights, and they might have variation in your jurisdiction. So first and foremost, victims have the right to fairness, dignity, and respect. And I always think of that as FDR, it's easy to remember. And this is essentially the backbone of the victims' rights laws. And it's very broad, and it encapsulates a lot of different things. And it's almost a fallback also for attorneys in court when they're representing victims and their rights, because it's very easy to make the argument that something might be unfair, something just violates this the FDR, right? The fairness, the dignity, respect of the victim. So that is really like the backbone of everything. The second right that is in every single statute, it just might vary in what it looks like, is the right to notice. And obviously, this is something very important because a victim can't participate in a meaningful way if they have no idea what's going on. So this has to be timely. So you have to be given notice of what's going on in a case, and it can't be like the night before you get a phone call and somebody says, hey, guess what? Tomorrow, do you want to give an impact statement? It can't work like that. And sadly, it does sometimes work like that. And more often than you probably think. And attorneys have to come in and represent the crime victims and assert their rights, or perhaps an advocate, depending on the jurisdiction, if the advocate's allowed to do that. So typically, this would be the right to be notified of anything at all that might implicate a victim's rights. So this could be something that starts with an arrest, the hearing, the plea, the defendant's release from prison, and also even if they escape. So this right to notice is going to be the entire process of everything from incarceration and all of that. You're going to have notice of all of that. It's a really important right. The next right is the right to be heard. This is a really significant right as well, because this is how the victim can impact what's going on and impact and advance their own interests. So this is essentially the right to express your opinion about what's going on when decisions are being made in the court. It's important here to look at your state statute very carefully, because in some states, there might be a right to be heard in every single step of everything. And then there might be other jurisdictions where they're limiting you, like that you definitely have the right to be heard, but it's not on every single thing. So sometimes you'll see a defense will be putting in a subpoena to get the victim's records for something, like medical records, or there might be like plea hearings. And so some jurisdictions might say that that is something that you would have the opportunity to be heard on those issues. But basically, it's just something to really take a hard look at, because those are critical. And that's how you figure out, are all of my rights basically being honored here. And also, I just want to mention that if I'm talking about this and I'm talking about these specific rights, it's important to also remember that while you have these very specific victims' rights, there are other protections in other areas of law that are going to apply just to everyone, right? So you might have the right to be heard just because of due process, right? And everyone has that right. So there can be an overlap there. So it's not like if you don't see one right that's enumerated in your state statute or the Constitution that doesn't exist. It's just that it could be somewhere else that an attorney could argue on your behalf to assert that right. So the next right is the right to confer. And this is the right to get information from and to give information to the prosecutor. Generally with this, we're talking about the status of the case as well as the disposition of the case. This really comes up a lot in practice with plea agreements. Some states require by law that a prosecutor must, it's an affirmative duty, they have to ask you and include you in the discussions about plea bargains. And before they can even file the plea agreement and present it to a judge, there are some states that require the prosecutor to actually file a document that says that they have in fact met their duty and fulfilled their obligation and talk to the family member or the victim and have taken into consideration what their wishes are and how they feel about this. So that's something that's another right. It's also one that kind of gets litigated because sometimes the victim gets forgotten. And I think that, happens for a lot of reasons. I mean, I probably have a whole conversation about, why that is. But I just think it gets overlooked because there's historically always been this, like, there's two sides in a courtroom, right? And it's like, well, what about the victim's rights? So it definitely gets eclipsed sometimes. The next right, also another one that is very, very often litigated, is the right to privacy. And this is the right to limit or to prevent the release of information about a victim, their private and personal information. So here you can see things like the victim's medical records being asked for, where there's like a privilege that's attached to that. It could be, depending on the nature of the crime, someone's prior sexual history. It can be their name even. I'm sure you've seen cases where it's like Jane Doe or John Doe, right? And that's to protect the personal information of the victim. Very often here, defense attorneys are going to try to seek the counseling records and therapy records. That's a really big problem because what happens is sometimes prosecutors want to not continue a case. In other words, they want this case to just keep going on track. And the defense will subpoena the records and the victim's like, wait a second, I don't want all of this information being out there, right? So they can either pro bono, or rather pro se on their own, and go into court and try to exercise their right and make a motion to quash. We call that a motion to quash, where you're going to try to prevent that from coming in, or they can have an attorney do it for them. And the whole idea is to prevent the disclosure, to protect the privacy of the victim. It's not automatic that stuff has to get turned over. So very often when a victim objects, they kind of feel sometimes alone because the prosecutor wants to keep going. And so they're not necessarily aligned with what the victim feels they want to do in a certain instance. And the defense attorneys, just sort of like, give me the records, right? So you kind of feel like almost alone in this, who's representing you here? So what happens is they can make a motion. Once the motion, if it gets denied, then that has to be litigated, that issue, if the victim wants to continue pursuing that issue. So this happens a lot. And so that has the impact of putting the trial on hold while those victims' rights issues are being litigated, right? So this is something it's important to note because it is such a common thing that when you do victims' rights work, like you hear about this all the time. And sometimes you hear like horror stories, they're just heartbreaking. So I just wanted to bring that up. Also, in regards to this right to privacy, there's other laws that are out there that may not be codified in the victim statutes and in the constitutional provisions, but you might see things like rape shield laws here. That also a whole body of law that's going to apply. It's just not listed where you might necessarily be looking in your state law. So just be aware of that as well. The next one is the right to be present. And this really is just the right to be present in court. Usually it's physically present, but it can also be virtually present. And some states have laws that say that a victim can be present for a trial, for example, the whole time. And we're actually seeing more jurisdictions doing that. But you will see in certain cases that the jurisdiction might sequester the victim, meaning that's just a fancy word for basically having the victim stay out of the courtroom until they testify and they're not going to be called back for anything. The policy behind that is because it has to do with the defendant's right to a fair trial. And so the idea is that if someone is sitting in a courtroom and hears other witness testimony, that might influence their testimony. So they want to make sure that the person is removed until they testify, then they can sit in the courtroom next year. So you might see that variation because that is definitely something that comes up. The next, we're almost done, by the way, with these rights, just so you know. The next is the right to protection. And this is the right to be safe from the accused, the perpetrator. And this can be found in the state constitution, as well as in statutes. You might see language here that a victim has the right to be free from intimidation, from abuse, from harassment, things like that. And again, every state is different, so you just have to look. But some states have more protections than others. Some states require, or they provide for the victim police escorts from the parking lot into the courtroom. I know in New York, they're required to have a separate waiting area for victims so that they're not sitting there with people that make them uncomfortable or they're in fear of, which is a good thing. And so you also see things like no contact orders, and that usually comes up with bail, like conditions of bail, where somebody's going to be released on bail, right? And they'll put the no contact order in, and that just means that the perpetrator, alleged perpetrator of a crime, is not going to contact you or a whole list of people. It's usually your immediate family, witnesses, potential witnesses, things like that. So you'll see that there as well. Next is the right to information. This, we're talking about the victim's right to be informed about victim services. So here, if there's a court-appointed advocate or a victim services office, you would be given that information as soon as your rights are triggered. You're also given information about the criminal justice process itself, and of course, what's going on with your case. That all kind of falls under that heading of the right to information. Depending on the state, you might also see specific language that talks about your right to obtain things like police records or court transcripts or pre-sentencing reports, things like that. The last right I'm going to talk about is the right to a timely disposition. And I left this one for the end because it's one that's really not my favorite. This is the right to have a case resolved without an unreasonable delay. This always turns on the specific facts of a case and if it's reasonable delay. So this particular right is so, in my experience, like very challenging to do anything about. And it's a common issue amongst victims and their families, right? That things are stalling because the court is like sometimes as slow as molasses. Like it's just like, oh my gosh, like it takes forever. And it's so frustrating and things keep getting adjourned over and over again, and it's just like one thing after another. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating for obviously the victim and their families, absolutely. It's also frustrating for those who are representing the families, and the prosecutor and possibly even the defense. It just depends on the court calendar, what jurisdiction you're in, all of those things. But because this is a right that's not often challenged, because usually there's some reasonable excuse, I'm doing quotes, reasonable, because it's like very easy to argue that. There's not a lot of case law in that area. And so there's not a lot of precedent there. And because the courts are slow, you're kind of in many ways stuck with it. I would love personally to see that law somehow, or the rights, all of that, to be bolstered somehow. To have someone look at that and say, wait, we got to do better with this. That's my own opinion on that one. But in some cases, courts will absolutely have a heightened interest in certain kinds of cases here. For example, you might see in cases involving minors that there might be priority given to this calendaring and the scheduling of all the proceedings in a case like that because it involves children. You might also see language about adults who are dependent on someone else or from a vulnerable population. And then you might see, like the elderly, perhaps, there would be an interest in having that case maybe get a little bit more priority status. So you might see language like that in your statutes. So that's really all of the basic core rights. And like I said, there's a lot more. And I will definitely be giving you guys some resources in a little bit that you'll be able to look these things up as well. So that's it for me for now.
Thank you, Jess. That was incredibly informative. And I know just by the comments that I'm seeing, people are, finding this to be helpful and definitely educational. I know that there are some families that we work with that have loved ones who have been missing or their cases have been unresolved for 30, 40 years. And this is probably the first time that they're hearing that they have some of these rights. And it's probably a little mind-blowing to them that none of those rights have been addressed in those many, many years. So I guess my question is there a statute of limitations on these victims' rights?
So basically, in order for the majority of these rights to attach, someone has to have standing as a victim, meaning the person has to be designated as a victim legally. That is going to be found in statutes each state as to who qualifies. But like once that attaches to someone and once they're legally classified as a victim under those statutes and constitutional rights and all of that, the rights attach. So once you are entitled to those rights, they're not going anywhere. They don't expire until the conclusion of the case. So that includes post-conviction, that includes the appeals process, parole, all of that. Like you're still going to have rights for the entire thing, So it might actually be like, depending on the nature of a case, you can have the rights the whole entire time until the end of your life. It could be that kind of length that you'll still continue to have rights. So even when your case is disposed of, in the sense that maybe somebody takes a plea and goes to prison or something, you still have those rights and can assert those rights.
I have a quick question, if I may. What are some common challenges or misconceptions families face when dealing with victims' rights, and how can they overcome that?
I would say one of the biggest challenge or misconception is that the DA is representing the victim. It's obviously like what we all go to, right? And their interest is very, very closely aligned with the victim as well. Everybody wants justice here, right? Everybody in a case where there's been an arrest and there's a pending trial or case, everybody really is kind of on the same page, but they're not really representing the individual family or the victim's rights. So that is something that I think to be aware of, because it's very easy to think that maybe you go along with the prosecutor because you think, oh, they're representing me, but they're really not. They're not. They represent the people, and they're trying to pursue justice. So their duty is not to the victim. If that makes sense. So I think that it's important to just be aware of that, and to take advantage of advocates out there to understand first and foremost, like, what are your rights? Like, go to some of the resources that I'll provide here tonight and look up your state and become familiar. And if you're not sure what it means, you can reach out to me, you can reach out to an advocate, try to find out, like, what are those rights in my state so that I'm well aware of it. That's definitely something to do. And then I would just say the other thing that sometimes can be I'm not sure, I guess it's a challenge more than a misconception, is about timing in the courts. Just because I think sometimes people think if the court has made it to a certain point, that it's just going to keep going, right? And when they're getting dates, okay, well, the trial's going to start on this date, that unfortunately things can change that, right? So I just think it's more of a challenge, and just to try to have a very reasonable expectation that dates and things like that can change. And the process, unfortunately, can be more lengthy than you might first anticipate.
I can spend probably a month of Sundays with questions that I've been writing down, but I know we don't have that much time, because if you can hear something, it's the wheels inside my head like spinning very slowly as they're starting to go around. But just something kind of near and dear to our heart here. What family members are covered under victim rights laws? Parents, grandparents, step-parents, siblings, etc.
Every state statute will have a definition. In New York State, for example, it's found in the executive law. So there'll be like a definitional section somewhere in your state's code, and it's going to define who that is. So you really have to look at that. Some states will have a broad coverage and say that, if you are, harmed in a felony or a misdemeanor, then you and your immediate family members are considered victims, right? But other jurisdictions might say, well, we only consider like victims for these victims' rights for violent felonies or certain kinds of crimes, and they might identify what those crimes are, like misdemeanors involving X, Y, and Z, right? And they'll be very clear about what is triggered. But it can definitely include family members. Absolutely, it's very common that it does. People who are dependents on someone, if the person is a homicide case or something like that, they might be included as well.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, it was interesting for us. Step parents were not entitled to some of the victims' rights because we were considered support people only. So we were, Nicole and Joe fought hard for us to be included, especially when somebody's such a big part of your life. But that was a really important question. Thank you for answering that. And I think you kind of answered some of this next question in your last response, but how do these victim rights laws differ across states or regions, and what variations should we be familiar?
Yeah, I would say here the most important thing really would be look carefully at like limitations, right? Look at, are you limited? Are you given a broad right here? Like, for example, like in terms of when we're talking about like with victims, like is it a broad category or is it more limited? Do you have the right to be heard? Is it broad? Is it everything? So is that what you should anticipate? Just being included in everything, having the right to be heard on everything, or is it more limited? So those are really particular things that I would say to look up, but they do all vary. Unfortunately, there's not like just one thing that applies to all the states. They're all very different, which is kind of a pain. But again, and if you have those questions, like you said, I know that I'm giving you all a lot of information, but feel free to send them my way, and I'm happy to answer them if I can.
Thank you so much for everything you've been telling us so far. I know, just like Jim, I'm like writing down questions. I'm like, I got to text these to her later because I'm going to be on here for hours. But I know that you've kind of touched on this before, but what are some resources available for families to better understand and navigate the Victims' Bill of Rights? I know you have some that you really recommend.
Absolutely. There's the Victim Resources and Rights through the National Crime Victims Law Institute. It's the one that I mentioned that I had attended last year. They are funded by grants, government grants, and they do a lot of the training of advocates and in particular crime victim attorneys. And so the first one is the Resources and Rights. And if you go to that is kind of broad when you go there. When you go on, I believe, if you wouldn't mind putting the link at some point in the chat, when you go to that website, it's the Victim Resources and Rights. I'm just looking at my notes as well to make sure I tell you the right one. But there's a little thing on the right-hand side, and it'll say like Victim Resources. So that's really a good place to start. You'll see that there's a lot of other things on that page, but I would start with the victims' rights section. And there's little videos, like when you start to click on there with resources, and they'll go into probably way more depth than I'm going into tonight. And really, it spells out a lot of what to look for, how things can be interpreted. You know, it really gives a good sense of all of these different rights and how to look at them. So that's there. The next is the Victim Law Library, and that is through the same organization. This one, when you look at it, you might be like, ew, because it's very, like, there's a lot of technical stuff, there's a lot of legalese and things like that. But what I recommend, this is a great resource. It's the go-to resource in terms of what I do. If you scroll down, you'll get to a thing that will have every single state in the country. And you just click on that state, and that state, all the laws are going to populate. And that's the best way to learn what am I entitled to, you know, in the prosecution of a case. So I would say start there. The next one is the PDF, which I have an example of it here. Again, this was put out by the National Crime Victims Law Institute, and this has various rights during certain stages of the criminal justice process. And it's kind of an overview, and like I said, because every state is so different, it's going to list a whole bunch of rights, but again, you have to go back to your state. But it's excellent. I don't know if you guys can see this, but it's like a little, it's like a mapping. It's excellent to know, like, so you can follow this along, like put it on your refrigerator even. And there's a section in it as well. It's the key to the victim's rights. I can see that. But it has all the different rights spelled out. Most of the ones, I believe all of the ones that I've gone over tonight, but also goes into much more. And so it will give you a little, you know, easy to understand blurb about what those rights are. And so that's very, very helpful. And thank you, Raul, for putting that in the chat. And then the last resource pertains to civil cases, because tonight I'm not really talking about that, and maybe that could be a topic for a different webinar and a different day. But you know, there's different avenues civilly in cases depending on all the circumstances involved. It's all fact specific, but I wanted to include this because this is a good resource for anyone really who has a civil law question. But particularly for families who might have a question at this point. And this is, it's going to come up under New York Free Legal Answers. That's the one where I go, like, because of my license being in New York, so I often find myself there. I tried to find one site that had everything there, like that would help everyone. But I found that when you go on the New York page and you just kind of scroll over to the right-hand side, there's all the states that offer something similar. And I will tell you that some of the states have rules about who qualifies, but it's to ask free legal questions. So some states will say, okay, you have to be income eligible, right? And you have to fill out a form and things like that. And you'll be able to ask your question to a licensed attorney in those jurisdictions that have this. So that's a really good resource, because you never know, like, what kind of right, you know, or situation, issue that you might be dealing with, because there's a lot, you know. And we always think with victims that, I mean, I have a tendency to go to like the criminal thing, like in my mind, oh, criminal, right? But there's so many layers of how victims can be impacted. So absolutely, this is a great resource for looking at things that may not fall under the rubric of criminal. Those are the best, I would say, in terms of resources.
So I have, I want to ask a question that is sort of alluded to in the chat a little bit, but and it's a three-part kind of question. So, do families have any rights when it comes to like the police refusing to investigate? And can you challenge any of those decisions made by law enforcement or the prosecutor's office if they disagree? And if so, what might those steps look like?
In terms of, I'm going to take the easier one first, and that has to do with challenging the DA. So like I had indicated earlier, right, you have the right to confer in most jurisdictions with the prosecution. So if you don't agree with something that's going on in your case, you look at, okay, what am I entitled to do here, right? Can I voice my concern? Am I allowed to be part of this and bring a motion about this issue, right? So you can absolutely challenge, like if you don't feel that you're on the same page and you have that right to be heard on that issue, then you can present that to a judge in court. And if that is denied, like whatever relief you're seeking, then you have the right to go to an appellate court and have them review that. So there are things you can do in terms of that. It gets tricky because prosecutors don't have to necessarily like follow what, like if a family says, I don't want to do this, right? The prosecutors aren't obliged to follow that. They're supposed to, in many jurisdictions, consider all of those things. And I would say, honestly, in practice, in my own experience, like most of the prosecutors do consider it and are willing to have conversations. And there are some prosecutors who really, they want to do what the families want, right? And you see that very, very often. But every once in a while, you might have situations where you're just not on the same page. So you absolutely can challenge those types of things. You just have to look at what your state statute says in terms of the type of decision that you maybe don't agree with. And do you have the ability to assert a right in that instance? In terms of challenging law enforcement, and I know that this one, particularly when I was working doing the cold case stuff, how this was very frustrating because, one case I was working on, and it was a very, very small police department. And I was telling Haley yesterday, it was a very sad case with a little boy who was murdered. And it was a town that was really rural. It was many, many years ago. And at the time, I think they had 2 police officers for the whole town. And so, it didn't get the kind of attention that perhaps being in a different jurisdiction, with different kinds of funding and more personnel, like that case would get. So that was really hard because, we kept going back to the detectives and back to that police department, which is now bigger, but I will tell you that it's still small, like when you compare it to other things, other police departments. And it was hard because, trust me when I tell you that I was like, I'm going to do whatever I can here. I would walk out of there and be like fuming because it was so frustrating, right? To get them to look at things differently or, assign a detective to get this out of storage. They didn't want to go get it out of storage. I'm like, can I volunteer and go get it out of storage for you? Like, if you have to drive across town, can I do that? It's like, come on, and it's so frustrating. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to taking legal action against a police department, it gets really tricky because they have governmental immunity. So anything like decisions they're making in their capacity as a detective, looking at the case, whatever, even if they're negligent, right, they're still going to have that governmental immunity. So that is a real problem. And also the duty, when you look at these kinds of cases, right, because like the argument is like, is the police negligent in this? Like, did they drop the ball? And of course, I'm sure, like, as advocates, I'm sure you could probably relate to that. There's lots of cases that you hear about and you go, oh my gosh, did they drop the ball or what? Right? Because it's like, oh yeah, and the general consensus is, yeah, this is a problem. And it's frustrating because you're limited. I will tell you that, for a negligence case, you would have to find like a duty owed. And the police and the work that they do, it's for the general public, right? So in other words, legally, a duty is not owed to an individual victim, right? So you also run into that problem, right? Because that's just the law. That's the way that is. I would say, however, that you might be able to go through a more of an administrative function, like the commissioner of police, if you feel that there's something going on, whoever the authority is, wherever you are, who is funding the police department. Like if it's, a department and it's like overseen, like monetarily, they get their budget, right, from the county. So like maybe you go to the county executive, right? So there's different ways you could handle it possibly that way. So it's kind of an administrative function as opposed to going into court. Because really the only other way would be to look at the case, and it's really a fact-specific thing, and to see, you know, is there a civil rights violation of some sort? And those can be really hard cases. And it always comes back to the qualified immunity, right? So you might say, oh my gosh, you know, you're looking at something and you're saying, wow, like this is bad, you know, and totally negligent. But you're stuck because of the immunity that's afforded to, you know, the detectives, police, in their capacity as an officer. So I hope that helps. You know, I know that that is a problem. And I will say, like, in my own experience, like, working with people with the cold cases, it's like a long day. And I mean, and I can't even speak on behalf of some of the families that I know you work with who have had cold cases for like way more years than what I've been dealing with, you know, with the people that I've been trying to help. So I feel for you, and I'm sorry that this is, you know, the state of things for you. And if you want suggestions, like, anyone can reach out to me, and I will try to help you, you know, come up with ways, or, you know, possibly give you, you know, suggestions on how to manage that. I do know that is a widespread issue.
All right, I have a two-part question.
Okay.
So, what legal action can be taken against a social media content creator who have or continue to cross the line? And how do we define, how do we even know what crossing the line is?
This is something that is near and dear to me, because of what I'm doing now, as the executive director of Faces. So because of the way the laws are regarding social media, there's a law, the 230 Communications Decency Act, sometimes just 230 people will say. And that is a very powerful, strong law that prevents platforms from being held liable for the activities, speech, and action of people who are appearing on their platforms, right? So that's a problem, because then the platforms are like, well, we don't have to worry about this, you know, and there could be some heinous thing going on their platform. And really, there's nothing in most cases that you can do in terms of holding them liable, which leaves you as a private person having to go and seek some kind of relief against a private person who might be causing problems. So criminally, you have things like, depending on the circumstances, you would have, you know, stalking laws that could be triggered, you know, harassment, trespass, depending on what the nature of, you know, what's going on. I know that there's a case right now involving a missing boy, and there's a creator who, the family, I think it's the first time that I've seen this, where a family decided to file for orders of protection. And I saw what the creator actually like filmed some of what they were doing to the family, and the family was saying like, this person is stalking us, right? And it looks a lot like stalking to me, just in my own opinion. So they got an order of protection. And so that's something that is something that families can do, that I think I haven't really seen that until recently. And it's, I think, a step in the right direction, because there are obviously wonderful creators out there. Like, there's professional journalists, there's people who have like ethics and everything. But unfortunately, there are people out there who may not understand limits, and they might, you know, start trampling on other people's rights. So yeah, so I would say, like, definitely don't hesitate. Like, if you feel unsafe, if someone's doing something and it's a repetitive action, right? It's something like, I mean, because I would say, like, depending on what it is, like, you give somebody like, oh, maybe they called me once, but they didn't call back again, right? So it's not really a pattern. So you're looking for things that are egregious, that are outrageous, that is a pattern, but things that make the victim feel unsafe. So that's really subjective, right? Like, it's whatever that person, if that person is receiving multiple phone calls, right? Maybe it takes 3 phone calls for that person to say, you know, I don't feel safe anymore. But it could, maybe somebody else is like, well, it's 30 calls, you know, so it's really contingent on the person. But I tell people, like, don't be afraid to call the police, to contact the police, you know, maybe let them know what's going on. If you feel that you're being harassed or intimidated in some way. There's also things like witness intimidation. You know, if someone is a potential witness in a case, including the victim, families and things like that. there's those laws that can apply. And then, of course, like the orders of protection. And then you have on the other side of it, civil actions, right? So there you're talking about cases like defamation cases. That word gets thrown around a lot. And defamation cases are one of the most expensive cases to file. And it's also in categories of cases, actually one that is not successful in many, many instances. So it's something to just be aware of, that it's something just, it's not like very easy, is what I'm saying, right? And sometimes it's even hard to find an attorney who's willing to take on a defamation case, so it can kind of even get into that. But then you have other causes of actions like intentional infliction of emotional distress, where someone's doing something that the behavior, what it is they're doing that's causing harm to, re-victimizing a victim, is so outrageous, right? That it's offensive behavior and it's causing damage to the person, to the victim, to their family. That's another civil cause of action that you might be able to assert and go into civil court. There's also false light, which a lot of people, I think, they throw around defamation, not realizing, well, what about false light? And that's not a cause of action that's in every single jurisdiction, but it is available in some jurisdictions. And that's interesting because it's similar to defamation, but defamation requires, something that's not true, right? It has to be factually like not true at all. But when you have the false light, that's more of implying something. So somebody might not be coming out making an accusation explicitly against somebody, but if you told a room full of people, everybody gets it. Everybody gets what you're actually saying. So it's the implication of what you're saying. It's putting someone in a false light. So that could potentially be a cause of action we could pursue. And then just recently I had someone contact me and we do research at FACES, and we track trends in social media. Like if there's something that's emerging, something that we're seeing that impacts and re-victimizes victims, like we pay attention to that. And we were contacted about a week ago by someone who was dealing with a creator who created a deep fake, basically. And they were using, my understanding was that it was unauthorized images of someone and of a victim and a potential victim. And they were, created a deep fake. And so you might have a copyright issue there because there's a lot of law out there about that. That's a big issue. Like there's even like the Take It Down Act is coming out now, which I think is actually good in terms of, how that could potentially have almost like a little bit of a domino effect in some of the victims' rights areas. But that's also something else that you could consider. But again, I would say things that families should be aware of are patterns. That's it. And if you're in fear of something, just call the police. Like, don't hesitate to pick up the phone, because sometimes I think people tolerate too much, and I mean that everyone's different, but don't be afraid to do that. You have rights, and don't be afraid to exercise them.
Thank you, Jess. So now we're going to get to kind of the Q&A part, and we've been marking your questions as we go. If you have any other questions, just add them to the chat now. We're going to try and keep it to not specific questions about cases, so broader. Our goal is to kind of educate you so that you can go and look up your state's statutes and then see what you can kind of apply to your case on your own. And like Jess said, if you want to send her a question afterwards, she's available to kind of walk you through it. Our families that we work with, we're here to help you walk you through those as well. So first question was something that we had gotten ahead of time is, do families have the right to go to the media with their story? Some PDs will tell families they aren't allowed to, and I will tell you firsthand, we have a family that we work with at Light the Way who was told by the New Hampshire State Police that they were not allowed to go to the media with their story, and they waited a full year to go before they let the media know that their loved one was deceased. So it is happening. It happened in the last 10 years. So what are families' rights when it has to do with the media?
I mean, generally speaking, now I'm not licensed practice law in New Hampshire, right? So I'm not gonna, unfortunately, I can't, because of my own license restrictions and things like that, I can't really and on all of this, by the way, is not legal advice. It's just like general information. But generally speaking, the police can ask a family to refrain from doing something, right? So they can say, don't talk about this, keep this quiet, don't go out and tell anybody that. They can make that request to you, but generally speaking, they can't prohibit you. I would like to see in that instance the authority for telling a family that. Nothing is coming to my mind, like off the top of my head, that could support that kind of thing. Yeah, that's the first time I've ever heard of that myself. So yeah, I mean, you have, the right to go to the media, like for awareness and things, like that, and to give interviews. And, generally, unless there's a law that is in another jurisdiction that I'm unaware of, there's no way to enforce something like that because there's really no authority to hold someone to that. It could just be a request.
Excellent. The next question is specifically about like missing persons in general. What about missing persons and victims' rights? Where a crime has not been formally established yet, are there victims' rights associated if you can't prove a crime has been committed?
Well, here, it would be very fact specific, right? So you'd have to look at everything going on in the case. And then you would have to say, okay, what has been done so far? What would you like to, get done on this that hasn't been done, that type of a thing. And then you would have to look at the general rights that would be afforded to any private person, citizen of the United States, and see, can we extrapolate rights from that, right? Yeah, it would depend really on the circumstances, but it doesn't mean that you don't have any rights. It just means that maybe there's no victim's rights because there hasn't been, an arrest yet. Very often in missing persons cases, people think, well, I'll just get an advocate from, the state or the county or whatever, right? And unfortunately, in many jurisdictions, that doesn't happen. I mean, if not all jurisdictions, because you have to be classified as a victim to be entitled to a court-appointed advocate or, to use their system, their offices that might exist for victim services. In which case, I would say, if that's you, anybody watching or watching replay, whatever, definitely look for community partners, right? So if it's not something that you can take advantage of through your jurisdiction, which probably wouldn't be, go to your community for assistance. But yeah, because the victim's rights are typically triggered once you are defined as a victim. And it usually attaches once an arrest is made and not at the investigative stage. So, I mean, and I've worked with families where, the investigating agencies like the police and the detectives and everything, they're wonderful, right? And they really want to help and they are there supporting the families. But again, sometimes you get stuck where you don't have that situation. And that's rough. So you have to look for other types of rights. Sometimes, if you had a cold case, and this is just a small example, I'm sure there's families in here who have much more extensive situations, but you might want to get some sort of a record, right? And you might be prohibited from that because you're not really classified as a victim, right? So it's well, how do you get this? So then you have to go through, the FOIA laws and look at the rights there. And can you go that route? And can you appeal a denial? Is there any other area? Is there something in the law in your jurisdiction that would entitle you to that in some way? So you just have to look at a broader category of laws.
What happens when the third party asks to be included and they are told no?
Third party. So I'm assuming someone who's not within the definition.
Oh, I know what this was. Bevan put this question. I think this is Bevan's question. She put this in when you were talking about how there's 3 parties in a court case. And so I think she's talking about the victim or the victim's families. What do you do when the police won't let them be involved?
Well, I mean, in a courtroom setting, they if there's a law that like if they're not within that parameter of what defines a victim, there's really like nothing that the person could do, right? So even if you were like a close family friend and you said, well, I want to take part in this, like you wouldn't be allowed because you might not be included in the definition. And in terms of, disclosing information about a case, typically the police will work with like the victims' families or like immediate family. And if there's someone else who doesn't fall within like the typical parameter of what that is for the jurisdiction, they might require, some sort of like power of attorney, for example, right? Like there would be a legal, they have to protect themselves because they can't just tell anybody, even if there's a close relationship with the family, right? If it doesn't fall within what they're procedurally allowed to be doing in that department. So you'd really have to look at the regulations for that specific department to see how that all would pan out. So unfortunately, it's very fact specific and contingent on where you are, what state are you in.
So I know kind of where she was coming from with that one. So it would be like, say a mom lost their daughter, was a victim of a murder, and you're not being included, say, with the DA in the plea deals that are being taken place or something like that. Like, is there a way to manage that?
Generally, like if you're not within whatever that definition is, they can exclude the person, unfortunately. I mean, you could probably attempt to see if there was any other, maybe a due process right or some other kind of a right to try to be included. But generally, like especially like a DA, they're going to be very stuck with whatever the statutory definition is, even if that means that somebody gets excluded.
What if you are part of that definition and they don't include you?
Well, that's when you file a motion. That's when you exercise your right to be heard and you bring it to the court's attention that you are within that definition and that you have every right to be included in all of this. And you would make a motion. And some of this can be done. I don't want people to watch this and think, oh my gosh, I need a crime victims law attorney. You really don't. Like, you can do this yourself. There's nothing, preventing anyone. I mean, maybe you'd feel more comfortable not doing it yourself. That makes sense too. But you can also do this yourself, but you would raise those issues in court and make sure, that you're exerting, opening your mouth and saying, wait a second, it's right here in the statute, because, everybody's human, right? And so, I've seen prosecutors, violate the person's rights, right? And like, they don't want to be the person that's going to report, oops, I violated the right. You know what I mean? So as an attorney, like who's representing a victim, like you have to bring that, right? So things like that can happen where somebody would be or should be included in something and in the notice part of it, and they're not going to be, right? So then in that case, you would assert your right.
I love that because I don't think victims feel empowered to know the information, right?
Yes.
Their rights, and then to actually feel empowered to walk into a courtroom because it's very scary to walk into a courtroom as a victim.
Yes.
I mean, it's intimidating as an advocate to a victim.
Right.
So I think, this is wonderful that we can empower people, and I hope that people feel empowered by hearing this information, that it is well within your right when you understand those rights within your state, that you can say, absolutely not, I'm going to file that motion and I'm going to say you're not including me. So I hope that people are feeling empowered by that. I know that I feel empowered by that because I have had to have a private meeting with a prosecutor and say, you violated victims' rights. And it was probably the scariest thing I've ever done. And there was consequences for that, but I had to do that on the behalf of victims. And it was scary, but the right thing was done in the end.
Yeah.
Next question. How do you hold law enforcement accountable when they can deny FOIA request due to a case being open and active even after, let's say, 45 years of a murder case going unresolved? So lengthy amount of time and FOIAs keep getting denied.
Yeah, in that instance, you can try to appeal those decisions. Those laws are so tough. And I know that I encounter them even as an attorney, like working with families, that like denial after denial after denial. And your your remedy is to keep appealing and to keep seeing, is there something, that I can do about this? Because those laws, I mean, yeah, like you can have a case that is out there like lingering for all these years, right? And they're still saying, nope, you can't have it. It's still considered active. And once, when it's classified like that, one thing that you might be able to do is look to see if, in your jurisdiction, is there another jurisdiction? Like if you're in a city, is there another jurisdiction that would have a cold case unit or another, some other resource available that whoever is withholding that information, especially in a cold case information, right? Like they have a legitimate reason to be not giving you the information pursuant to FOIA, to see if maybe they would be willing to take on that cold case. Like maybe there's more resources in a neighboring jurisdiction, and you could try to coordinate something like that. That might just be like a practical way to do something about it, because if a nearby jurisdiction was willing to like take that on, then maybe that would open up new avenues, right? Maybe they would look at the case and say, okay, we're going to re-interview all these people, we're going to do this, and we're going to include the family now a little bit more, right? You never know like what could happen with that. So it's something to consider. It's a little bit out of the box, but I think sometimes with cold cases, I was just today, in fact, I was at a seminar and the prosecutor said, with cold cases, he said in his experience, he felt that cold cases don't get solved because the traditional methods of going about solving the case aren't working. So he was talking about advances in some of the tools that they're using in prosecutions to try to help get these cold cases solved. So I kind of feel like we're with that sort of situation, because those FOIA laws are so strong. I used to, in my former position years ago, I actually used to have to deny them. It's like part of my job was to like assess whether or not, and it was like, oh my gosh. And then we would get them from media, like we get them from all kinds of people, and and you have to go with the law. And there were times where I know in my capacity then, like I would get the phone call from somebody who's like really mad that they can't get whatever it is that they wanted, right? And I was that person. They think, oh, you're to just. I'm like, thanks. Right? And and I would say to the person, listen, like, I would love to help you. I would love to just hand this over to you, but then like I'm not doing my job because I'm stuck with this. Just like we're all stuck with this, right? And so the only thing like in that instance is that the person could appeal it. There are, in terms of FOIAs, one thing I will say, in New York State, there is the Committee on Open Government, right? Which I think me and Raul, once I had sent him this information, he does a lot of that work, I think. And that is a great resource for people, and other jurisdictions have similar offices. The one in New York has someone there who's really like a guru on this stuff. To the extent that sometimes where we were stuck as attorneys, we would get on the phone and call this guy and say, what do you think about this? And he's an attorney, but it's for open government. So their role is to really promote access to records and materials, right? So one thing that you could look at is to see if your jurisdiction has a similar office like that. Like I said, I'm most familiar with New York because of my history with New York. But other jurisdictions have similar things to my understanding. So that could be a way, because, they typically, like in my experience, like they err on the side of recommending disclosure in a lot of cases that could be iffy, and they're sometimes willing to intervene and even get opinions and help you through your situation, whatever that might be, as a private person and a citizen of the state.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What can families of missing people do if they're kind of being taken for money by people who are claiming to be like licensed PIs, anything like that, and they find out that they're not, and they've put a large amount of money into that?
Well, first of all, always document everything. I mean, make sure that you're, however it is that you're being approached, right? Like if it's something that's online, make sure that you save the written documentation of everything. If someone is coming to you and saying, well, I have this whatever the accolade is, right? Like maybe I'm licensed to do this, or I'm a private eye and I can do this, or whatever the case might be. Unfortunately, in this day and age, you really have to vet the person always, right? Just check the person out, like see if they're licensed, like what is it that they're offering you? What service is this? Because I know a lot of this comes up where people say that they do like certain kinds of research, or investigation type of thing. And definitely take a look at, are they actually licensed? And if somebody says to you, well, I can do this or that for you, try to make sure, reach out. You can always reach out to me if you want as a resource, like where I can kind of give you ideas, like how you can vet that information. Because I know it's sad, because families will be in, a situation where they're like, they just want the help, right? And so they're vulnerable to people who might have, intentions that are not pure, which is so unfortunate. But definitely the best that you can do is try to vet it as best as you can. And always, if you feel like you were conned, right, go to the police. Like, don't hesitate to go to the police, because, there's people out there who are unfortunately slick, right? And they're, it's so unfortunate, but it happens. So just be aware. And like I said, like if somebody says that they are part of something or they do something, like, if you're not sure and you don't know where to turn, like seriously, like send me an email. I will try to help you resolve it, because sometimes it's just as easy as like, okay, well, what are the license requirements in this state? And you start looking them up and you're like, wait a second, this person can't do what they say, because in order to do what they're promising, they have to be licensed, and they're not licensed. And, whatever it is they're promising is not under, the licensing regulations for that area, for example, right? And then also, even if somebody is legitimately like, we're going to provide this service, ask for references, right? And I know it's cumbersome and I know it can be annoying, but it's really the best thing to do to make sure that you're working with people who are really looking out for your best interests and going to help you.
Well, thank you, Jess. I see that there are so many more comments still coming in, and I wish we had all the time in the world to keep going. This is such an important topic, and maybe we will do another one of these webinars on victims' rights and just focus on something else. And I see all of you connecting, and I think that's just so wonderful. That's another reason why we wanted to get all of these webinars going, because we know that families need this support, and you need to know that other people are going through the same exact thing that you are. And we see that as, groups that work with a number of people, but know that you're not alone. Know that you're not alone. There's so many people who are asking the same exact questions, because you're all seeing this no matter what state you're in, no matter what county you're in, no matter how many years you've been going through this. It's the same types of things that you're struggling with. So we hear you, we see you, and we're trying to find the best ways to reach most of you and help you all at the same time. We wish we had a magic wand to fix it all. And we're going to keep trying to find ways to make this a better place for you and your families, and to find answers for your loved ones. Jess, where can people follow you or reach you if they have additional questions?
You can email me. The best way to get a hold of me would be at info@Faces for Change. It's FACESFORCHANGE .org. That's the best email for me. You can visit our website. It's facesforchange.org. And we have resources there. If you scroll on the top, there's little sections, and you can go there, and we have a resources page with different information for you. We have a blog, and and we're always also looking for, if anybody is interested in helping, we actually have an intern now, which is awesome. It's been great to have a college intern. But we also have volunteers. If anybody's out there who knows any attorneys, like, we would love to have more attorneys, because right now I'm the only attorney, and it would be so awesome to one day get to a point where our organization could actually provide some of the legal services that victims need, particularly when dealing with social media. But even people who might watch, YouTube, or go on TikTok, or wherever you find yourself, like on a social media platform getting information. We even have a program now where we have volunteers who are going to report back to us on some of the stuff that they see. Because like, obviously we can't be everywhere and we're trying to track trends. Like, so if people are out there, even if you don't want to formally volunteer with us, that's cool too. Like, you can even just send us an email and say, you know what, I saw this, or I keep seeing that, and let us know. Because part of what we're doing is really trying to research and create an evidence-based approach to these things. And there's no way that we're going to be able to try to really make changes that are going to make a positive change for victims unless we are informed of what you're experiencing. So victims too, like families too, like please feel free to share your stories with us. We can keep them completely confidential if you like, and never tell anybody like your identity and that type of thing, unless like we were required to do so under the law. Of course, that's my disclaimer because I have to say that. But we would love to hear any perspective. We welcome all perspectives, and the good and the bad, right? Because it's not all bad. There's a lot of good out there too on social media. But like I said, for us to try to make an impactful change, we definitely need your voices. So feel free to contact us. And if we can help, you know where to get us.
Well, thank you, Jess, for joining us tonight. We appreciate everything that you taught all of us on the panel, everybody who is in the chat. We appreciate you. We appreciate everyone who joined us this evening for sharing your questions, sharing your stories. We love that you're willing to spend your evening with us. If you're coming to AdvocacyCon next week in Indianapolis, please stop by our tables, come say hi, get stickers, give hugs. We look forward to seeing you. And we'll catch you next month on our next webinar. Bye, everyone.
Bye.